Hey everyone, it's Jamie Batts, your instructor for Bio 204 AMP2. We are moving into Chapter 20, talking about the lymphatic and immune system. And this chapter in this semester that I'm teaching right now is divided into 2 weeks just because of how the schedule works. So this first week we're just focusing on the lymphatic and the immune system, and then we'll get into immunity next week. It's not going to be like that every semester, so but you guys kind of got lucky like that. Let's go to screen share. Take a look at this PowerPoint and get moving and shaking through this system. It's a brand new body system, and we alluded to it a little bit in the last section. If you remember, back in Chapter 19, we talked about how the rate of filtration is greater than the rate of absorption within the capillary network, which means there's a lot of extra fluid to the buildup of something like 3.6 milliliters per day, or liters per day. It was a large amount of fluid that was not reabsorbed. I'm not a numbers person. I don't even remember all those specific numbers. So what I'm getting at is the lymphatics is the system that's going to suck up that remaining interstitial fluid and get it moving through the body. And so in this chapter, we're going to look at how that happens. The lymphatic system includes the cells, the tissues, and all the organs that are not only responsible for immunity, but it's also responsible for getting that extra interstitial fluid back into the bloodstream. So that extra filtrate that is left over at the capillary bed, that's getting back into our bloodstream via the lymphatics. So let's take a look at some of these. You know what? I'm going to switch like this. There we go. And so the components of the lymphatic system include lymphocytes. You should recognize that word lymphocytes, right? We talked about lymphocytes when we were talking about different types of formed elements, different types of blood cells. Those lymphocytes, remember, they were the smaller ones. The nucleus pretty much filled the entire cell when you looked at it under the microscope. These are the primary cells of the lymphatic system. These are the cells that are responding to pathogens like bacteria and viruses. They're responding to abnormal cells, like cells that have been infected by a virus or possibly cancer cells. And they also recognize foreign proteins like the toxins on bacteria. Lymphocytes typically are formed within the lymphatic system. Some of them are formed in the red bone marrow, and we'll look at that later. But lymphocytes are also surrounded by lymph. Typically, lymph is a special interstitial fluid that has gone into the lymphatic vessels, and we'll talk about the lymphatic vessels in a minute. The lymph is the fluid. So if you think about, if we draw a comparison between blood and lymph, right? Blood is made of plasma and formed elements. Lymph is made of lymphocytes and this extra interstitial fluid that we call lymph. So there's cells and fluid in both lymph and blood. So lymph's a weird word if you say it several times. Well, maybe I had too much coffee. Yeah. All right, so lymphatic vessels are often called lymphatics. The lymphatics are the vessels that carry the lymph throughout the body. They begin in the peripheral tissues, and they end connecting back to our veins. So you can think of the lymphatics as these little vacuum hoses that are anchored right near the heart, right near the superior vena cava, and those little vacuum hoses trickle out and tree branch all throughout the body, and they're sucking up the extra fluid that was not reabsorbed by our bloodstream, or it was not reabsorbed by the capillaries. So that's in a nutshell how the lymphatic system works. It's sucking up, they're like little vacuum hoses, sucking up that extra fluid. The lymphoid tissues and lymphoid organs are scattered throughout the body. The primary lymphoid tissues and organs are where lymphocytes mature. This is places like the red bone marrow, the thymus gland. And then there's secondary tissues and organs where the lymphocytes are activated or where they're copied or cloned. These would be places like the lymph nodes, the tonsils, MALT, which stands for mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. This is the special lymph tissue that's in our mucosal linings, like within our mouth and all of the external mucous membranes, right? Appendix and spleen are also secondary lymphoid tissues. They're places where lymphocytes become active and where lymphocytes can be copied. Here is an image of the distribution of the lymph tissue and lymph organs throughout the body. You can see all of the vessels are kind of converging, almost like the venous system, where they get larger and larger as they get closer to the heart. You can see that in this image. Those vessels are getting larger as they get closer to the heart, and in the periphery, they're rather thin and spread out, kind of vein-like, but they're open-ended. Literally picture vacuum hoses scattered throughout the body. Your tonsils, your thymus gland, which is that kind of fatty organ. It's a lymph tissue that kind of drapes over the heart area and the mediastinum. Spleen, that mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or the MALT, which is in the digestive, respiratory, urinary, reproductive tracts. Your appendix, the red bone marrow, the lymph nodes, and then there are some specific terms that we'll get into when we learn all of the nuts and bolts. You can pause the video here, go back and review this little section, the introduction to the lymphatic system. We're going to continue and talk about the lymphatic vessels. So these are carrying the lymph from the peripheral tissues back into the venous system. So all of the extra fluid that was not taken in by the capillaries on the venual side for reabsorption, these are going to be, or this fluid, I should say, is going to be sucked up in the lymph and dumped right back into the venous system right near the heart. Lymphatic vessels tend to be very closely associated with our blood vessels. So you'll have a vein, an artery, and a lymphatic vessel all right next to each other within the body. They have a network called lymphatic capillaries, and that is kind of the end of the vacuum hose, so to speak. So the lymphatic capillaries are the smallest lymph vessels. They're almost in every tissue, in every organ. They're very closely associated with those blood capillaries, which makes sense because on our blood capillaries, we have this large amount of filtration. We have a smaller amount of reabsorption, and that lymphatic vacuum hose is there to suck up the extra. So it's right there within the capillary bed network. That interstitial fluid, which is then called lymph, once it enters the lymphatic vessel, is transported to larger vessels. Here you see what I'm talking about. Here's our capillary bed network, and all that green stuff is our lymphatics. Arteries are red, veins are blue, lymph is green, and nerves are usually yellow. So let's talk about those lymphatic capillaries. They're different from our blood capillaries. So you have to detach yourself from this idea of a very small endothelial lining and this exchange and all of that we just learned about in the last few chapters. Lymphatic capillaries are kind of like pockets as opposed to tubes, right? So imagine the end of your vacuum hose is kind of pocketed like this. And then the fluid can kind of squeeze in through that little pocket on the end of the vessel. They have much larger diameters. They have much thinner walls than our vessels. There's no pressure driving them, so they don't need that elastic rebound, right? The basement membrane, which is usually there to hold everything together and hold everything in place, is pretty much absent. And they have a flattened or irregular outline, even more so than the veins do. They have those overlapping endothelial cells, like I said, kind of like a pocket. They overlap, and that acts as a one-way valve. So it's only letting fluid into the cell, or into the vessel, rather. So this is permitting that unidirectional flow of fluids. It's not going to be able to flow back out of the lymphatic unless there's damage to the lymph, right, to the lymphatic vessel. This is also allowing any viruses, pathogens, cellular debris to come into the lymph, right? It's acting as just this one-way door. Whatever's left over here in this interstitial fluid, come right in here, enter the lymphatics, we'll handle it, right? So that gets into the role of the lymphatic system. Remember, one of the roles of the lymphatic system is sucking up the extra fluid, and it plays a role in immunity. So you want those bacteria or viruses or cellular debris or whatever else, whatever junk that's laying around in the capillary bed to be sucked up by these lymphatic vessels, so that our lymphatics can deal with it, handle it, and attack whatever pathogens are there, right? This is also going to prevent the return of those materials back into the interstitial space because they have those unidirectional valves, those one-way valves, not allowing for that lymphatic fluid to go back out into the interstitial fluid. So here you see what I mean. They're pocketed, they're large, have a very large diameter compared to the veins and arteries. They overlap, and they have these little slits which allow for just about anything. Think of like a sinusoid or a fenestrated capillary. It's kind of like that, where they're overlapping, have these large gaps, and just sucking it all up. Anything that's extra. Cells can fit through, right? Cellular debris, bacteria, all that stuff. So let's talk about how these vessels are structured. So they're very similar to veins. The larger lymphatics have valves to help keep everything moving along through those little checkpoints. The vessels are going to bulge at each valve, and so these bulges kind of make the vessels almost look like they're a string of beads. And you can flip back, maybe I will flip back to this picture here, and you can see a little bit. Well, those are the lymph nodes, but if we were to zoom in on like these vessels on her legs here, you would see that they almost look like little beads, and that's because those valves kind of bulge a little bit. So the valves prevent that backflow of lymph, just like the valves in our veins, and the contraction of the skeletal muscles push that lymph through, just like in the veins. There's the bulges. So the lymphatic vessels are distributed in the small intestine. They're primarily spread out in the small intestine for the purpose of lipid absorption from our digestive tract. It's a special lymphatic capillary called lacteal. So when the food, and we'll talk about this when we get into digestion, but when you eat food, all of the proteins and carbohydrates are absorbed directly into the blood, right? And they go to liver can sort it and filter it and whatever. The fat that you're eating is not going into your blood right away. It's going into your lymphatics. It's going through the lacteal. So that lacteal is then going to circulate all of the fat through the lymphatic network, and eventually it ends up in your blood, right? There are areas that do not have lymphatic capillaries, areas that don't really have a blood supply, like the cornea of the eye, right? That's very fibrous. Their bone marrow does not have a lymphatic supply, and our brain and spinal cord do not have a lymphatic supply either. You can pause the video here, go back and review this section on lymphatic vessels. Let's talk about how the lymph flows. So there are superficial lymphatics, and then there's deep lymphatics, just like veins, right? The lymph system is very, very similar to our venous network. Those superficial lymphatics are just deep to the skin. They're in that subcutaneous layer. They're within the areolar connective tissues, within our mucous membranes, the digestive, the urinary, reproductive, and respiratory tracts. And they're also within the serous membranes, like the pleura, the pericardium, and the peritoneum. So they're there, again, to help aid in protection and suck up extra fluid or any junk that might be accumulating. The deep lymphatics are the ones that are accompanying those capillary beds in the deep vein and artery networks that supply our skeletal muscles, our neck, the visceral organs, etc. All of the vessels converge, and they form what's called a lymphatic trunk, right? So just like in our veins, we had the small veins and the medium-sized veins, and then we have the larger veins, right? You're going to see that same kind of flow here. You have these superficial lymphatics and deep lymphatics converging to form lymphatic trunks. And here you see kind of what we're talking about, the superficial, right, in the fascia, and then the deep going into the, right next to the veins and arteries. Now, those trunks are going to collect into a duct, and there are two lymphatic ducts. So there are several lymphatic trunks, but there's only two lymphatic ducts. I know, it's weird, right? So the thoracic duct, this is collecting lymph from any body part that is inferior to the diaphragm, so basically all your abdominal viscera, reproductive system, legs, and the left side of the superior part of the diaphragm. So the left side of the thoracic cavity, the left side, oh, this is my right side, the left side of your, the left arm, the left side of your head, right? All going into and draining into the thoracic duct. The right lymphatic duct is collecting lymph from just the upper right corner of your body. So the right thoracic cavity, right arm, right side of the head, just above the diaphragm, right? So these two ducts are going to drain into the subclavian vein. You have a right subclavian vein and a left subclavian vein. The thoracic duct drains into the left subclavian vein. The right lymphatic duct is draining into the right subclavian vein. Guess where they go? Into the right and left brachiocephalic veins. Guess where that goes? Into the superior vena cava. Guess where that goes? Into the right atrium. And then whatever was just sucked up by all of those areas of our body is now in our blood. So there you see these zones that are drained by each of the lymphatic ducts. So there is something called the cisterna chyli, or chyli. It's pronounced chyli, technically. This is an expanded chamber that's at the base of the thoracic duct. So this is getting the lymph from the inferior part of our abdomen, like our reproductive organs, the pelvis, and the lower limbs, right? The lymph is drained into this area by the lumbar trunks and the intestinal trunks. Remember, we said the trunks drain into ducts. Well, the lumbar and intestinal trunks drain into the cisterna chyli, which is just this kind of sifting chamber, if you will, before it drains into the thoracic duct. So here you can see where everything is. So these green vessels are the trunks that drain into the duct. Here you see that one of the ducts, and here's the right lymphatic duct, and here's the thoracic duct. Obviously, the thoracic duct is much larger. You don't see, oh, yeah, you do. The cisterna chyli right here at the kind of right underneath the diaphragm, draining and collecting all of the lymph from the lower part of the body. It's another like filtering station. So lymphedema is a blocked lymphatic vessel. So this can be caused by blocked lymphatic drainage that is not occurring. So imagine that vacuum hose that's typically sucking up the extra fluid. For some reason, there's a kink in it or a blockage. And so the area that is no longer being sucked out or whatever by that lymphatic vessel is going to become swollen, distended, can be painful, infected. This is most often seen in the limbs. It can affect other areas of the body as well. The swelling can actually become permanent, and the connective tissue can lose its elasticity if that swelling is so extreme and exists for an extended period of time. Stagnant interstitial fluids can actually accumulate toxins and pathogens, and the local immune defenses can become very overwhelmed, which then leads to infection. Like that. That just looks so painful. Oof. So you can pause the video here, go back and review this section. Yep, actually, I was thinking I wanted to stop, and I do. So we're going to stop this video here on general lymphatics, and our next little video will be about the actual cells of our lymphatic system. See ya.